Welcome to the deep dive, listeners. We are diving into some really choppy waters today. The global economy is looking pretty shaky right now.
Definitely some stormy seas ahead.
You've given me a whole stack of articles, and, things are intense. We've got what looks like a full-blown trade war brewing between the U.S. and, well, its biggest trading partners, Canada, Mexico, and China.
Yeah.
So we are here to help you make sense of it all and figure out, what does this actually mean for the future of the global economy? Where are we headed?
And these trade wars, they often have a much deeper story, beyond just the economic headlines.
Okay, so let's just jump right in. The breaking news. March 4th, 2025, the U.S. just imposed some brand new tariffs on imports coming from Canada, Mexico, and China.
Right.
And of course, we know there was already a 10% tariff on Chinese goods, so this isn't entirely out of the blue. But this feels like a huge escalation. Can you break down the specifics for us? Like, what are the actual rates we're talking about, and what's the official justification coming from the White House?
Sure. So the U.S. has imposed a 25% tariff on almost all imports coming from Canada and Mexico.
Wow.
And then on top of that, they've also added another 10% tariff, this one aimed specifically at Canadian energy.
Oh, wow.
And for Chinese imports, well, those tariffs, they were doubled. So now they're sitting at 20%.
Okay, so some big numbers there.
Yeah, and the White House, they are justifying all of this by citing national security concerns.
Okay.
So for Canada and Mexico, they're pointing to, issues like fentanyl trafficking, illegal immigration, things like that. And then for China, it's more about highlighting their inaction on those same drug flows.
So they are basically saying, hey, this is about protecting ourselves, but I have a feeling that Canada, Mexico, and China aren't just going to sit back and just take this quietly, right?
Yeah, you're right on the money there.
Yeah.
They've already started retaliating with their own set of tariffs against various U.S. goods. And this is where things start to get really interesting.
Okay, so let's dive into these countermeasures. What products are they actually targeting, and what kind of impact are we expecting to see from all this back and forth?
So China has gone straight for, I guess you could say, the American heartland, right? They've imposed a 15% tariff on a whole bunch of U.S. agricultural imports. Things like chicken, wheat, corn, cotton, the staples.
Right.
But they didn't stop there. They also added a 10% tariff on soybeans, pork, beef, and other food products.
Okay.
Now, this isn't random. If you look closely at the articles you gave me, you'll notice that China's clearly learned from previous trade spats. They're strategically targeting sectors, particularly agriculture, that carry a lot of political weight in the U.S. It's a way to apply pressure,
So it's not just about the economic hit, it's about hitting where it hurts politically, too.
Exactly. And Canada. Oh, they haven't held back either. They've implemented tariffs on a massive $155 billion worth of American goods. It's basically a tit-for-tat response. I mean, Prime Minister Trudeau even went so far as to accuse the U.S. of trying to completely collapse the Canadian economy.
Wow.
Though he did admit that outcome's probably not going to happen. And then there's Mexico. President Claudia Sheinbaum, she's promised retaliatory measures by Sunday if the U.S. doesn't back down on these tariffs.
Okay, so we've got tariffs flying back and forth like arrows in a, medieval battle or something. But let's get down to brass tacks here. How are these tariffs actually impacting different industries? And more importantly, how is this all going to impact, you, the listener?
Yeah, that's the key question, right?
Right.
And it's pretty clear from your sources that a few key industries are already feeling the heat.
Wait.
One of the biggest casualties is the automotive industry. You see, the North American auto industry, it's incredibly integrated. To build a single car, parts might cross borders like multiple times during the production process.
Huh? Oh, wow.
And each time they cross, those tariffs add to the cost. And you know who ultimately ends up paying for that?
The consumer.
Exactly. Some analysts are predicting price increases of up to $6,000 per car.
$6,000.
Yeah, and guess what? That's going to affect things like car insurance premiums too.
So a $6,000 price hike on a car, that's massive for both, consumers and the auto industry itself. But the pain doesn't just stop there, right? What about other sectors?
Oh, absolutely. Agriculture is another big one. We talked about China targeting soybeans, and that's a direct hit on American farmers who, frankly, were already struggling from previous trade disputes. This is a sector that's really feeling the pressure.
Yeah, it almost seems like China is trying to exploit these existing weaknesses in the U.S. economy.
And there's another surprising victim. Housing. Those tariffs on Canadian lumber. They're very likely to drive up construction costs and push home prices even higher. It's a ripple effect that's touching all sorts of different parts of the economy.
Okay, so this is all starting to sound pretty concerning. So where do we go from here? What are the bigger economic implications of this escalating trade war? Are we staring down the barrel of a global recession?
Well, there's definitely a growing fear of something called stagflation. And basically, that's a really nasty combination of high inflation and sluggish economic growth.
Okay.
To understand this, we need to, define stagflation quickly. It's like being stuck in quicksand. Prices keep rising, but the economy isn't moving. We're already seeing some warning signs. The S&P 500, that tracks the stock market, well, that's wiped out all its gains since the election. And to make matters worse, the Atlanta Fed, which is like a regional branch of the central bank, they've slashed their economic growth forecast. They are now predicting a 2.8% annualized decrease.
So you're saying there's a chance the U.S. economy could actually shrink in the first quarter of 2025. That's a scary thought.
It is. It's a real possibility. But here's the thing. The U.S. Federal Reserve, you can think of them as the folks who try to keep the economy, on an even keel. They're probably not going to let things just spiral into a full-blown stagflation crisis like what happened back in the 1970s. They have tools, right? Like raising interest rates. That can help fight inflation. The problem is raising interest rates can also slow down the economy even further. It's a tricky balancing act. It's like you're trying to walk a tightrope. One wrong step and everything could come crashing down.
Yeah.
And to make matters even more complicated, the situation's just constantly evolving. Economists are all over the map with their predictions. Nobody really knows how long these tariffs are going to stay in place or what other retaliatory measures might be thrown into the mix.
It sounds like we are in uncharted territory here, but your sources also highlight something that's really fascinating. The way these tariffs are exposing just how fragile global supply chains actually are.
Yeah.
It's something we probably just take for granted, right?
Right.
We're so used to getting whatever we want, whenever we want it from all over the world.
Yeah, we click a button and boom, a package magically appears on our doorstep a few days later.
Right.
But this trade war is like a stark reminder that those intricate networks, those systems that make all of that possible, they are actually quite vulnerable. We are already seeing the consequences in sectors like automotive, where parts might cross borders multiple times during production. Each time they cross, tariffs make things more expensive, more complex.
And as we talked about earlier, those costs ultimately get passed down to us, the consumers.
Right.
But it's not just about price hikes, is it? There's also the potential for, shortages and delays.
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. If a key component for a car, like something essential for production, suddenly gets hit with a 25% tariff, it might not make economic sense for manufacturers to import it anymore. That could bring production lines to a screeching halt. Suddenly, that new car you've been eyeing, might be out of reach for months. And this vulnerability, it isn't limited to just cars. We were talking about agriculture earlier, taking a hit. Especially with China's strategic targeting of soybeans, it seems like they are really trying to exploit those pressure points in the U.S. economy. Why soybeans in particular?
Right, yeah. Why soybeans?
Well, soybeans are a major U.S. export to China, and they are a key ingredient in animal feed. By targeting soybeans, China is aiming to, inflict some economic pain on American farmers, a group that already has some political clout. Remember, these trade wars are often as much about domestic politics as they are about international economics. China is playing a strategic game here.
So it's not just about hitting the economy, it's about hitting those specific groups who can then put pressure on U.S. politicians.
Exactly. And the impact goes beyond just soybeans, too. China has also slapped tariffs on other agricultural products like pork, beef, and various fruits and vegetables. This could really hurt American farmers, and it might even lead to higher food prices for Chinese consumers. It's a lose-lose situation in many ways.
Yeah, it sounds like everyone loses in a trade war.
Yeah, that's a common sentiment. Yeah. But it's important to remember that trade wars are complex. Sometimes they are about more than just pure economics. They can be about national pride, about gaining political leverage, about achieving long-term strategic goals. The real question is, how far is each side willing to go, and what are they ultimately prepared to sacrifice?
It sounds like a high-stakes poker game with nobody really knowing what cards the other players are holding. We've talked about the immediate impacts on different industries, the potential for just supply chain chaos and the political motivations behind these tariffs. But I'm curious about the bigger picture. What are the long-term consequences of this escalating trade war? Could it lead to a complete restructuring of global supply chains, a shift in global economic power? Or is this just a temporary blip, something we will all forget about in a few years?
Those are the million-dollar questions, and unfortunately, there are no easy answers.
Right.
It's a messy situation with so many interconnected factors. But here's what we do know. This trade war is a symptom of a much larger trend, a shift away from the hyper-globalized world we've become accustomed to.
So you are saying this isn't an isolated event, it's part of a bigger global shift? What does that mean for us, for everyday people and businesses? What should we be prepared for?
Well, businesses need to become more adaptable.
They need to think about diversifying their supply chains, exploring new markets, and being ready to adjust their strategies on the fly.
Right.
And for consumers, it might mean higher prices, maybe even some scarcity. We might have to make some changes to our spending habits and start paying closer attention to where the things we buy are actually coming from.
It's a wake-up call, isn't it? We can't just assume that the world will always operate the way it has in the past. We need to be more aware of these global forces and be prepared to adapt. But what does adapting to a less globalized world actually look like? I mean, is this trade war signaling the end of globalization as we know it?
That's a big question. It's probably too early to say definitively, but we are definitely seeing a rise in nationalism in countries wanting to become more self-sufficient, to bring things back home.
So instead of relying on these intricate global networks, we might see a shift towards more regional or domestic production. But wouldn't that make things more expensive? And what about the impact on innovation? Don't we benefit from global collaboration and the exchange of ideas? You are hitting on some really important points. There are definitely trade-offs. A less globalized world could lead to higher prices for consumers, and it could potentially stifle innovation if countries become more isolated. But it could also lead to more resilient economies, less dependence on, potentially unstable global supply chains, and maybe even a resurgence in domestic manufacturing.
It sounds like there are both potential benefits and drawbacks to this shift. So how do we navigate this new landscape? What are the key things we should be paying attention to as this trade war unfolds?
Well, one of the most important things to watch is how companies respond.
Right.
Will they try to find ways to work around these tariffs, maybe by shifting production to different countries? Or will they just try to absorb the costs, which could lead to higher prices for consumers?
So we need to keep an eye on the corporate world and see how they adapt. What else?
Another key factor is the political landscape. Will these trade tensions escalate even further, leading to even more tariffs and retaliatory measures? Or will cooler heads prevail, leading to negotiations and some kind of resolution?
So we've got to watch the political chessboard as well. It seems like there's a lot of uncertainty right now. But amidst all of this complexity, is there anything positive that could come out of this trade war?
That's a great question, and believe it or not, there is a possibility that this trade war could actually lead to some positive changes.
Really? How so?
Well, this trade war could force countries to take a hard look at their existing trade policies and address some of the underlying issues that led to these conflicts in the first place. For example, maybe it will force countries to confront unfair trade practices or renegotiate agreements that have become outdated or imbalanced.
So it's like a forced reset, a chance to rethink the rules of the game.
Exactly. And it could also incentivize countries to invest more in innovation, to develop new technologies that reduce their reliance on imports. Maybe this will be the push we need to see breakthroughs in areas like renewable energy or advanced manufacturing.
So amidst all the doom and gloom, there's a glimmer of hope. This trade war could actually be a catalyst for positive change, a chance to build a more equitable and sustainable global trading system. It's a fascinating thought.
It is, but it's important to remember that any positive outcomes will depend on the choices that leaders make in the months and years ahead. Will they choose cooperation and compromise? Or will they dig in their heels and continue down this path of protectionism and isolationism?
It seems like the future of the global economy hinges on those choices. The stakes are incredibly high, and the whole world is watching to see how this plays out. But before we wrap things up, I want to touch on one more thing that your sources highlight.
And what's that?
The potential impact on the global balance of power. I mean, this trade war could have major geopolitical consequences, right? Could it shift the balance of power away from the U.S. and towards, say, China's rivals?
That's a distinct possibility. If China's economic growth slows because of this trade war, it could definitely weaken their global influence.
Oh.
At the same time, other countries like India or those in Southeast Asia, they could see their economies and their political power grow as they attract more investment and become bigger players in global trade.
Right.
This trade war might actually just speed up a trend that's already happening. A world where power isn't concentrated in one place, but spread out among several major players.
It's like the world is rearranging itself right in front of us. But with all these potential downsides for China, who stands to benefit the most from this whole shakeup?
Well, countries in Southeast Asia, they're well positioned to attract manufacturing that's currently based in China.
Okay.
They offer lower labor costs, maybe even less geopolitical risk.
Mm-hmm.
And Mexico, they could also come out ahead as
Yeah.
companies look to move production closer to the U.S. market.
Right, yeah.
That's something called nearshoring, by the way,
Mm-hmm.
basically bringing production closer to home. But it's not just about location. Companies also need a stable political environment and business-friendly policies to feel confident about investing.
So some countries might come out of this stronger, while others struggle to adapt. But this all sounds a bit like a zero-sum game, you know? If some countries win, does that automatically mean others have to lose?
It's not that simple.
Okay.
While there will likely be winners and losers, the bigger picture is more nuanced. It's about how this whole reshuffling of global trade impacts everyone, not just individual countries.
It's like a giant puzzle with all the pieces being rearranged. So as we try to make sense of this puzzle, what should we be watching for? What are the key indicators that will tell us which way things are heading?
One thing to keep an eye on is how global supply chains evolve.
Mm-hmm.
Will we see a complete decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies? Or will they find ways to maintain some level of interdependence? The answer to that question will have huge implications for businesses and consumers around the world.
So will we see a world where products are made primarily within specific regions like North America or Europe, or will global supply chains remain interconnected even if they become less reliant on China? What do you think?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think we are more likely to see a hybrid model emerge.
Okay.
Companies will probably diversify their supply chains, sourcing goods from a wider range of countries. But they'll also look for ways to streamline production and reduce costs.
So maybe it's not about complete decoupling, but about creating more resilient and flexible supply chains that can adapt to changing global circumstances.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between efficiency and risk management.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground, from the immediate impacts of tariffs to the potential for a global economic power shift. But as we wrap things up, I want to leave you with this. The future of the global economy is not predetermined. It's being shaped right now by the choices that leaders are making. So stay informed, stay curious, and keep asking questions. And who knows, maybe this trade war will ultimately lead to a more resilient, more equitable, and more sustainable global economy. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
If China's economic growth slows down because of this trade war, it could definitely weaken their global influence. At the same time, other countries, like India or those in Southeast Asia, could see their economies and their political power grow as they attract more investment and become bigger players in global trade. This trade war might just speed up a trend that's already happening, a world where power isn't concentrated in one place, but spread out among several major players.
So it's like the world is rearranging itself right in front of us, but with all these potential downsides for China, who stands to benefit the most from this shakeup?
Well, countries in Southeast Asia are well positioned to attract manufacturing that's currently based in China. They offer lower labor costs and maybe even less geopolitical risk. And Mexico, they could also come out ahead as companies look to move production closer to the U.S. market. That's something called nearshoring, by the way, basically bringing production closer to home. But it's not just about location. Companies also need a stable political environment and business-friendly policies to feel confident about investing.
So some countries might come out of this stronger while others struggle to adapt. But this all sounds a bit like a zero-sum game, you know? If some countries win, does that automatically mean others have to lose?
It's not that simple. While there will likely be winners and losers, the bigger picture is more nuanced. It's about how this whole reshuffling of global trade impacts everyone, not just individual countries.
It's like a giant puzzle with all the pieces being rearranged. So as we try to make sense of this puzzle, what should we be watching for? What are the key indicators that will tell us which way things are heading?
One thing to keep an eye on is how global supply chains evolve. Will we see a complete decoupling of the U.S. and Chinese economies? Or will they find ways to maintain some level of interdependence? The answer to that question will have huge implications for businesses and consumers around the world.
So will we see a world where products are made primarily within specific regions like North America or Europe? Or will global supply chains remain interconnected, even if they become less reliant on China? What do you think?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think we're more likely to see a hybrid model emerge. Companies will probably diversify their supply chains, sourcing goods from a wider range of countries, but they'll also look for ways to streamline production and reduce costs.
So maybe it's not about complete decoupling, but about creating more resilient and flexible supply chains that can adapt to changing global circumstances.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between efficiency and risk management.
Well, this has been a fascinating deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground from the immediate impacts of these tariffs to the potential for a global economic power shift. But as we wrap things up here, I want to leave you with this. The future of the global economy is not predetermined. It's being shaped right now by the choices that our leaders are making. So stay informed, stay curious, and keep asking questions. And who knows, maybe this trade war will ultimately lead us to a more resilient, more equitable, and more sustainable global economy. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.